Welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining us. Today we've got another episode of Scientology Stories. I'm your host, Marc Headley. And today's guest, we have a very special guest today, an author, John Atack.
Hi, Mark.
Hey, John. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, a real pleasure. And as we said, we've not met before. and,
Yeah, we've never actually spoken or met before until this video right here.
till this very moment.
And John wrote a book. It was in 19. When did your book come out? 1990?
The first edition was 1990.
Yeah,
And
so A Piece of Blue Sky in 1990. I was just in the Sea Org. I had just joined the Sea Org in 1989. So I had been in the Sea Org a year when that book came out. And you got into Scientology, I think, in the early 70s.
74, December 74. Oh.
There you go. So you were in Scientology a year after I was born. So your Scientology time periods predate mine pretty much exactly by that amount of decades, and then we're kind of all coming for full circle these days, back in the future.
I mean, when I was, first interviewing people to write what is now "Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky," I was meeting people who'd got involved in 1950.
Yeah,
And
I
then
was just going to say,
then you got the
there's so
generation of the
many.
60s, and I'm the
Yeah.
70s, and it just keeps on going, and it just gets worse and worse.
It's wild because there's so many decades. I mean, for those who those who are just watching this, and maybe this is your first video you've watched on our channel or on John's channel, Scientology's been up to nonsense for about 70 years, 70 decades, or 7 decades. They've been up to the nonsense that is Scientology. So there've been different a series of whistleblowers over the decades for that time, and very few of these people have sustained consistent whistleblowing that entire time. Some people come and go. Some people are there for some people are there for a hot minute, and then as soon as they blow the whistle, they disappear, or Scientology gets to them, or it's wild. The thing I wanted to ask you was, so you were in Scientology starting in 1974. You wrote your book in 1990, and the thing that always is curious to me is, why did you write the book? Like what you were, obviously you knew they were up to no good, but what possessed you, or what incentivized you to say, I've got to write a book?
I just found out too much information that we hadn't been told these things. My first day out was October the 18th, 1983, and I'd been asked 3 days before to host a meeting at the Crown Hotel in East Grinstead, which would be the first meeting of defecting Scientologists in the UK ever. And there was this character called Captain Bill who was going to be there, and I'd never heard of Captain Bill. And I got to the door, and there were two members of what was then the Guardian's office standing by the door of the hotel, smiling and taking our names down, and the harassment began immediately. My incentive initially, I left the mother cult, whatever the Church of Scientology might be. Of course, as you and I know, it doesn't actually exist. It's hundreds of corporations that operate under that fictitious name. But I really believed in Scientology. I'd done OT levels, the upper levels through to 5. So I'd done 25 of the then 27 available levels of Scientology. I'd trained as an auditor, done 6 courses doing that. I'd done the Data Series Evaluators course, which is a big one. And I really believed. I'd never been on staff. I'd never been a living member. I had no idea what was happening. And I think that was the thing that got me. Within a few months of leaving, I found myself at the middle, the very centre of the independent movement in the UK. And I stopped believing. And the harassment came on down, and we didn't know about this. So going,
About
oh,
the harassment.
yeah,
Like,
exactly.
you thought everything was the way it was, and then when you no longer thought or no longer believed what Scientology was telling you, that's when like, once you started kind of saying to other people, "Oh, there's this is something that this is not really the way it is, it's really this way." Is that when the Guardian's office started to kinda dig their claws in?
It started on the first day. As soon as we said we were going to be meeting, there were about 60 people there. They started
Yeah,
issuing suppressive person declares the next day.
just for meeting.
Yeah, for having been there, and took them a
Wow.
few months to get to mine because my ethics file was only this thick,
Yeah, you
and they were commendations. Um, so in the end, I was declared suppressive for having given an auditing session without a case supervisor directive. And
Okay, so for those of you who are listening, or those of you who are watching, well, first of all, the ethics file. Whenever you do anything in Scientology, good or bad, if there's any reports or any documentations on it, it goes into your file. Everybody's got a file. They call it an ethics file in Scientology, and I call it a dossier.
oh, absolutely, yeah,
they're
it's an intelligence
they're
dossier.
keeping
Hmm,
yeah, they're keeping track of you and any information on you they're gathering. And those files now, these days, those files are all being digitized so they can share and access that information internationally instantly.
hmm,
But in addition to the ethics file, in Scientology, if you're doing an auditing or a counseling session, it has to be within the confines of the Scientology business setup. So you have to have all these pieces in place. And also, Scientology needs to get paid.
hmm.
So if you're doing it out of that, and outside of their control, they're obviously not getting any money, and they also can't control what's happening, and they can't gather any information that's obtained in these counseling sessions. So and that essentially is the biggest threat to Scientology by what is called the independent movement. So there's a lot of people that believe in Scientology, but they don't want to play by Scientology's rules in terms of the business and the intel gathering and all that stuff. But they like the technologies or the procedures or the therapies, and so they'll try to do that outside of the confines of Scientology. So you were declared because you had a session without
I,
it being a case supervisor.
yeah, and the reality was that I'd actually phoned St Hill to talk to a case supervisor before giving a session to a friend who was ill, and I'd been
Oh
given a
my
directive
goodness.
over the phone. It was because it wasn't
Uh-huh.
written down, and that was all they could find in 9 years of membership.
Oh my.
So,
So it
I'm
was really
pretty
just
clean.
a witch hunt, and that's what they figured out.
Mm,
What they were like. Okay, we've got this.
mm.
We can use this to discredit him, or to kind of when you're a Scientologist and you get a declare, it's sort of just like a black. It's like a burn notice or
Yeah.
a black mark against you to anyone who knows you in that realm. They
You
just
you
say this
you're
guy's a
being
bad guy.
yeah, you're being told that you're an antisocial personality, the psychiatric term for a psychopath,
Yeah,
and the term used by Hubbard, um,
yeah.
for his suppressive person declares. And I it was realizing what I'd actually been involved in, that I thought I was involved in an organization that was going to end war, criminality, and insanity. And I was actually involved in an insane criminal organization that had declared war on me. And that gave me the resolution. And I think that's something that people don't necessarily understand. It's said that only 6% of people will continue with a complaint. 94% of people will fall away if you can just
Hmm.
hold them off for long enough. But there are some of us who are born stubborn. And in fact, there's a Ron Hubbard story called One Was Stubborn, and I am that one. I, and I,
Yeah.
I just realized that I had, if you like, given all of my positive energy to this group for 9 years, or much of my positive energy to it, and all of my
Yeah.
money. And
Yeah.
it was actually destroying people's lives. So it was
Mhm.
through the looking glass. It was realizing this is the opposite of what it claims to be. It's not liberating people, it's enslaving them. And I just got curious that, that this story, finding, so for the book, there are 150 people were consulted one way or another, whether it
Mhm.
was a book they'd written or an article or testimony they'd given or interviews that I did. And I did a lot of interviews in the US and in the UK. And putting all of that together and saying, well, there's no history of this group. And apart from Janet Reitman's kind of abbreviated version of my work, I'm afraid, she does say it chapters 1 through 7, largely based upon A Piece of Blue Sky or Barefaced Messiah. And of course, Barefaced Messiah was based on Blue Sky. I was the researcher for it, and Russell had the manuscript before he started. Um, but
And Russell Mil and you're talking about, Barefaced Messiah,
yeah,
which was written by Russell Miller, and it had come out in, I wanna say in the late '80s,
it,
right?
it came out in late '87
'87?
um,
Yeah,
originally, and then Henry Holt suspended publication in the US because they were frightened of what might happen in the courts. Um,
based on Scientology's threats filing lawsuits and
oh,
trying
yeah.
to keep this, d before I forget, didn't Russell write the foreword to your book?
He did, yes. Um,
Okay,
and
perfect.
I mean, I've got the printout of Blue Sky, which was then called Hubbard Through the Looking Glass, that I
Yeah,
gave to him, and I've got his annotated version of it where he takes my chapter titles and things like this. But
yeah,
I would say about half of the material in Barefaced Messiah, which is it's not only a great book, what a great title, Barefaced
yes,
Messiah. But about half of the material in there came directly from me. I was the expert witness for it, as well as the all of the documents that were questioned
yeah,
by the cult had come from me. Um,
yes,
and it was kind of the way it felt at the time was like if you were interested in some historical figure, let's say, and you say Henry VIII or Abraham Lincoln, and you had the chance now to interview their retinue, the people who were around them. And that was
yes,
what I had. I interviewed so many people who had been right at the top of Scientology from its beginnings. I mean, I interviewed Don Rogers, who was there, was on the board of the first Dianetic Foundation in April 1950, and he gave me the title. He said, when we opened the doors to the first foundation, just before he opened it,
yeah,
Hubbard turned to me and he said, "Let's sell these people a piece of blue sky,"
yes,
and that's what's been happening ever since. Um,
yeah,
but I just felt outraged and a little sullied myself that I'd been part of this, and I wanted to do something to make it clear to people what this organization is, and have
yeah,
tremendous respect for the autobiographical books. And I always recommend yours first, and I think there are nearly a
thank you.
hundred now, because it's funny. you know, there
Yes.
there are places in there, where when the war is over event in '93, where
Yeah,
one of the camera lenses has got apple juice on it,
yeah,
apple spit, and the other one, the cameraman's looking down Shelley Miscavige's cleavage, and you ended up, I
yeah,
believe, having to. There's a huge amount of money was spent just to put in a
yes.
few minutes there and make it look real. So,
The part for me, which was, I love that you say that, and then thank you very much.
mm,
I'm flattered that you would say that. I'm not in by any means. I don't usually refer to myself or call myself an author, but I did happen to write a book.
mm,
Um,
very good
but
one.
um, but when I was writing it, I thought people think that this is like a deadly serious activity and this is all run a certain way.
Mm,
And really, for being working there for so many years, it's basically like a bunch of high schoolers or
yeah,
middle schoolers, literally the people that are between 12 and 18 years old running these
mm,
organizations that don't have an education. It's all about, personal politics and rumors and the whisper web, and it's not run efficiently or in any sort of smart way whatsoever,
no,
and it's all being sort of commanded by this David Miscavige character, and I wanted people to understand that no, it's a
yeah,
madhouse where we work.
mm,
And it's not only is it a madhouse, it's comically a
Mm.
madhouse. And I wanted people to see that, but also it's hard when you had, 15 years of very heavy trauma.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell that story and not find the comedy in it, or not find
Mhm.
to not recognize the absurdity of it. And the absurdity is what's funny.
Mm.
When you start telling, like, this is actually what happened, you're like, it's impossible. That's impossible that it happened. And then as it unfolds, you're just like, oh, this is crazy. But it's funny. It's so crazy that it's funny.
Mm.
But okay, so you said that you were talking about the
Yeah.
autobiographical books that have
The,
been written.
there are some, there are a bunch of really good, I could sit here for 5 minutes listing, Jefferson Hawkins and, of course, um, Janice Gillam Grady's books,
Yeah,
Marjorie Wakefield, The Road to Xenu. That was an astonishing piece of work. So there's been a lot. You're going right back to the first one in 1951, A Doctor's Report on Dianetics by Dr. Joe Winter, which is a fine
yeah,
book. Um, Helen O'Brien, Dianetics in Limbo. She was the head of the Hubbard Association of Scientologists and ran the Philadelphia doctorate course. And her book was never finally published, but she left it with the Library of Congress, and she kindly sent me a copy of it. Um,
yeah.
and so there are these really important, significant books. I wanted to pull everything together and make a history and say, this is chronologically what happened. I wanted to look at Hubbard's life. A couple of journalists had done it. There's a guy called James Phelan in 1963, who's the first and should be
Hmm.
sainted by those of us who've left Scientology, because he was the first person to point out that Hubbard was lying about everything.
Yeah.
His schooling, his expeditions, his war service. He was the first person to get there. But it seemed important to me to take the claims that Hubbard had made and show
Hmm.
that he contradicted them, which I only came
Yeah.
to realize after I'd left. But I gathered 22 published biographies. Well, actually, 21 published and one unpublished, the Tompkins biographical notes.
Hmm.
And no story is ever told the same way twice. So
Yeah.
he was either 2, 4, or 6 when he became a blood brother of the Blackfoot people, the Pikuni.
Yeah.
And of course, they never had blood brothers. Their
Yeah.
tribal historian in 1990 in the LA Times went, we never had such a thing. It's a Viking idea. And Hubbard is
Yeah.
going, at 2 years old, I became a full blood brave. It's like,
Yeah.
it's quite something, this guy. And that absurdity is the absurdity whereof you speak, that you've got this science fiction writer, and he did that for a couple of years, this pulp writer, this adventure story writer, who decides he's going to export this set of lunatic ideas. And that's difficult now for me, coming back to it and going, it doesn't actually make sense, any of it. That,
Yeah.
when I finally decided I didn't believe it anymore, which was around the beginning of 1984, an appropriate year for it, I suppose, that
Yeah.
I looked at it and went, I don't have any body thetans. This
Hmm.
silly idea that you've got all of these clusters of little beings through your body, demons, dibbuks, gadons, every literature has them. It was that this
Yeah.
is the worst kind of nonsense. And
Yeah.
I pretended, I went along with it. And
Yeah.
then in my last auditing sessions, which were outside of the mother cult, I just
Yeah.
sat there and went, no, I don't have any. Other people might have them, but I haven't got any. And
Yeah.
I felt so much better. It's like, in my last
You know
session,
that?
I had a PTS rundown, and I'd never had one
Yeah.
before. In 9 years, I'd not had one. Can you imagine that? And I demanded, this is the potential trouble source, somebody who is troublesome to Scientology. And I'd never
Yeah.
been considered that. And the idea is you're connected to a suppressive person. And so this really highly trained auditor, I balk at the word counselor. I don't think that Scientology is actually a form of counseling in any way, but we don't
Yeah,
really
that's
have
true.
a.
I say counseling to as a translation word.
Yeah,
I
I do it
understand
too.
it's not really, but
Yeah,
when you say auditing, people are like, "Oh, there's like accountants involved," and you're like,
yeah.
"No, it's
Well, there are,
ugh." There are
They
definitely
will be
are, but they
counting your
don't do
money.
any of the auditing.
But it is fundamentally and plainly, and it's very hard for those of us who are involved to believe this, but it's a form of hypnotism. It's a form of
Yeah,
guided imagination, to use Oxford University's definition of hypnotism. You go
yeah,
into this imaginary world where you start to believe you have these engrams, these traumas that you've got to abreact or relive. And then you've got all of these visualization processes, the creative processes, as Hubbard called them, which he got straight from Aleister Crowley, by the way, along with quite a lot of the rest. So you've got all of this
yeah,
stuff going on that you're being put through. And so my last session was, I was asked who was suppressing me. And I hadn't really thought what the answer would be before I sat down and
mhm.
was asked the question. And I looked at the auditor and said, Ron Hubbard. And she went white. I'd never seen anybody blanch like this before. It's so much against what she believed, having to sit there and listen
Yeah.
to this terrible man say this. And she said, could there be anybody else? And I just looked and said, I could list lots of people, but this is it. It's Ron Hubbard. That's he's been suppressing me for 9 years. And it took me
Yeah,
about a year to get how poetic it was that Scientology is being PTS to L. Ron Hubbard. It's being in a state
yes.
where you are a
It's so
potential trouble
funny
source to L. Ron Hubbard, that's for sure.
It's so funny that you say that because at the international headquarters, again, if you're a Sea Org member or a Scientologist or a Scientology staff member or employee, at any point, if you have an accident or you get sick, there's no question you are a potential trouble
Mm,
source. It's just that's it. It's period. There's no gray zone. You're a potential trouble
mm,
source, and if you are a potential trouble source, then you are connected to a suppressive person. And so there would be the time periods at the international base where there would be a slew of accidents. Like
mm,
multiple people would get in
mm,
car accidents, or would be unalived, or there would be someone would lose a finger, or all these things would happen. And they would almost happen in groups, like
mm,
multiple in a week or a
mm,
month's period. And it would always be when there was a huge push, or when there was something that David Miscavige had just recently done, and it would be like, well, these people would have to go get interviewed on why they had had an accident or what had happened. And it would almost be like it's a trick, because it's the person you have to say is David Miscavige. But if you say David Miscavige, then that's it. You're
yeah.
going to be in the biggest trouble you've ever been in your life. So you can't say David Miscavige. But the answer that's on the tip of your tongue and in the front of your mind is David
Mm,
Miscavige, and you have to figure out something else to say. And it's funny that you didn't see. We knew that from all the past people who had been interviewed. You didn't know that, so you just said it. It was L. Ron Hubbard.
most certainly was, yeah.
Yeah, there's another thing that we did. It's funny that you mentioned the hypnotism, because at the international headquarters, we shot this video called "How to Use Dianetics," and it was essentially the cliff notes on video for
Mm,
how to do Dianetic auditing,
yeah.
so that you didn't have to read the book Dianetics. You
Mm.
could just watch a 30, 45-minute video,
Let's
and then
face it,
you could
reading
just
that
sit.
book is traumatizing. 400
It is,
pages of
and
contradictory nonsense. Yeah.
not only is it almost impossible to get through, it's almost impossible for Scientology to sell somebody that book
Yeah.
and expect that they are going to go and do that auditing in the book
Mm,
on their own. So they had to make a kit for somebody that had a video, and it had some cassettes, and it was basically like, this is how you could do this.
mm,
We want you to do it, but we really want you to do it so much, we're going to give you all these other things that make it so you don't have to read the book to do
mm,
it. You can just watch some videos and listen to some cassettes, and you could get going. And when we were shooting that video, there is a scene in that where somebody says, well, isn't that hypnotism? And then we did a very clever way of showing that, although it sounds like hypnotism and it looks like hypnotism and it works exactly like hypnotism, so not
mm.
hypnotism.
Yeah, I
and
mean,
it and I remember thinking about that even when we were shooting this video.
yeah.
Is this hypnotism? Like, are we they seem like very, very close cousins, or maybe unknown brother and sisters. Okay.
Yeah, the I think the single most shocking piece of research I've ever done um, was it published as a paper called "Never Believe a Hypnotist," and that's a quotation from Ron Hubbard in the book Science of Survival. Never believe a hypnotist. Now, he frequently boasted that he'd been using hypnosis since he was 16. So never believe a hypnotist. There's a little bit of a clue there. And I went through everything I could find between 1950 and 52, where words that are used in hypnosis, like trance, suggestibility, were used. And I pieced that together. And I remember doing it now because I typed up the quotations I was taking from the many different sources, and then I printed it all off and I cut them out into separate quotations and then started putting them into different piles so that they'd fit together. And it really hit me. This was about 1993. It really hit me that Hubbard knew exactly what he was doing. That there's a
Yeah.
description in 50 to 52 of how you enslave somebody psychologically. And then he stops talking about that and just does it. Perhaps the classic example, which relates to early book one so-called Dianetics, the
Hmm.
mental science of modern health, as I like to think of it, um, he cancelled that method. In 1951, in Science of Survival, he says you must not use this method because it's
Yeah.
hypnotic. And when it was re-released in 1977, the book one course, you got this thing about waiting for the pre-clear's eyelids to flutter, which Hubbard
Yes.
names as a specific effect of hypnotic trance. So
Yeah.
you've got this situation where they're actually using a technique that he himself had banned and outlawed because it is definitely hypnotic. And if you go to anybody who's involved with Scientology and you say this is hypnotism, they'll go, no, it isn't. It's just
Yeah.
immediately reject that thought. And then you say, what is hypnotism to them? And they go, it's where you go into a state where you think you're a chicken, or you're taken over. And you go, that is deep trance.
Yeah.
When I interviewed Don Rogers, and I think Tony Ortega's put up the letters that Don sent to me on his site, and they are incredible. Um, he said, well, actually, up until the last minute, when the book Dianetics was commissioned by Art Sepos at Hermitage House, he was using deep trance. So all of the original work was done using deep trance. And indeed, in the book, he says at one point, hypnotism was never used in the research of Dianetics. And at another point in the
Yeah.
same book, he says, this came out of research using hypnotism. But he turned around to Don Rogers and said, we're going to have to use another method. And the Dianetic method was not tested on anybody. The 273 cases that he claims had been cleared in
Yeah.
that book, not one of them ever came forward. And he
Yeah.
just used standard deep trance, actually a method that I traced down last year. Finally, I found the hypnotist in Britain who'd developed the original method, who was quite famous. Agatha
Wow.
Christie was treated by him. He was a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And it's the original
Wow.
Dianetic method, which then it changes. What we're being sold in book one is actually Josef Breuer's method, which Freud started with. Speaking of
Yeah.
charlatans, but let's not go
You
down
know,
that road.
Hubbard had no qualms about stealing anything from anyone, that had
Mm,
anything to do with how he, cobbled together Scientology. When Ron Miscavige Sr., David
mm,
Miscavige's father,
yep.
when he first left Scientology, he contacted me. It's funny that the name of the book was the look had that looking glass, because that is exactly what he said.
Mm,
He said, I had done a radio show in Los Angeles on a radio station called KFI AM 640, and they had a show called Coast to Coast AM,
mm,
and it sort of had to do with the paranormal and aliens and UFOs and stuff like that. and it was a late night show. And the main reason that I had picked to do that show is because the international headquarters were about 2 hours from Los Angeles, and one of the only radio stations that you could pick up clearly was KFI AM 640, this AM station that had a very large transmitter that could go that far, and you could tune it in very easily. And Ron Miscavige and his wife, Becky Miscavige, listened to my radio interview on that station on an iPad that they were given by David Miscavige, because you could just tune into the stations digitally and listen to your local radio stations, or however they did it. But he said that I was saying all the things that were happening at the property, and he was at the property. He was still in the Sea Org. They were still loyal Sea Org members. Everything was, they were there. They were listening to this radio show, and they were going, he's saying, everything he's saying is true. This is what's happening here. And when they ended up getting in trouble for listening to the show and bringing up, saying, hey, he brought up these things are valid points, these things shouldn't be happening. And they're like, you can't be listening to SPs on the radio. And he sort of said that was sort of the beginning of the end, because then they were like, what are we doing here? And then they were like, you can't listen to that. And they're like, and he's like, but what he's saying is true. And they're saying it's not true. He's an SP. And they're like, no, we're here still. We know this is happening. And he said, it was like I was looking through the looking glass. Like, oh my God, am I living in this other world? But I don't know. I've never known that I was living in this world. And when he started explaining this to me, I thought, that's funny. And he said, what I'm doing? I'm on a project where I'm trying to find every piece of Scientology and where it came from. And so he had found, there's this book called I think it was called the keyhole theory, or the key system, that had to do with engrams and different things. But he had kind of found all these different writings, and the thing that he was saying was, these are all from the late 1800s and early 1900s. All these techniques and these, even study technology was not. L. Ron Hubbard didn't come up with that. It was a couple that came up with it, and they kind of, pitched the idea to him, and then he just crossed their names off and wrote his name and was like, hey, Scientology, here's study technology. So it was like all these little things that he was telling me. And I thought, he really did take a lot of things from a lot of places. And then it was all basically just boiled down to his research when he was a pulp fiction writer, and in the early 50s when he did all this, or the 40s when he did all this quote unquote research that was the basis of Scientology. And you're just thinking like, dude, you didn't do any research. Come on.
No.
Your research was you reading other people's stuff and then just taking it and
Plagiarism.
changing it just enough that maybe somebody wouldn't see, like, oh, this is this, or this. You have to have to knowingly study Scientology and study these other things to be able to figure out which one is a copy of the other. If you hadn't studied this other guy, or Freud, or this guy who treated Agatha Christie, you would never know that that's where Hubbard lifted it from.
No, and I mean, firstly, Ron Miscavige was a lovely guy. Let me just put that in. I really like Ron Miscavige, and he did play the trumpet for me at one point, which was, I'm very
Okay,
happy.
good.
But it was really weird to think that somebody as unpleasant as David Miscavige had this lovely man as a father. And also, I remember I met Ron Jr. in 1975 when he was in the Sea Org, and he was just really impressive young man. It's really quite something. But
well, just so you know, they did call Dave when they first got into Scientology. Ron Miscavige's wife, I want to say her name was Loretta, and Ron, I guess both of them. His nickname, David Miscavige's nickname, was Enrique in Theta, because he was always just a nightmare compared to all the other kids. And so it's funny that even at a very young age, they pretty much had his number.
and it says something about genetics that evidently this is a condition he was born with. That, and even
Yes.
having decent parents didn't change that, which
Yeah.
is very sad. But Jeff Jacobson wrote 2 excellent papers in the late 80s, I think, about Hubbard's use of other people's ideas. And
Mhm.
I used those as a platform to say, well, can I show that Hubbard knew where these things came from? So I wrote a
Nice.
paper called Possible Origins of Dianetics and Scientology, which I think is a really fantastic title. And one of my
Is that up somewhere? Can we link to that?
yeah,
Okay, perfect.
that
We'll put a link in the description to that, as well as all these other things that we're talking about. We'll put links to these in the descriptions if you guys want a deep dive. I mean, the thing about even the fact that we've got John here today, I've only been doing this since 2006. Okay,
for a newbie,
talking about Scientology and exposing it and putting out a book. John's
40
been
years,
doing this for 40
40 years last
years.
October, yeah.
Yeah, so that is a wealth. I mean, there if you wanna know where all this came from, people have figured it out. It's not like it's a mystery, and it's also, not like we're not willing to tell you about it. So whereas Scientology wants all of us to be excommunicated and not be able to say anything, the fact that Scientologists today can go on YouTube and say, "Where did L. Ron Hubbard get all the Scientology stuff from?" And there's a place, and it says it, and it's very usually I haven't looked at the link that we're going to
Mm,
share from John, but in most cases, we're citing books, we're citing references, we're showing the policy that Hubbard said, and you can compare them, and then you can easily see. I know that when Ron Miscavige was showing me some of these things, it wasn't even like he changed it in some cases. In some cases, he even uses the same terminology and the same keywords and the same, like, he doesn't really make a big effort to cover his tracks that this is where he lifted it from. He just lifts it whole cloth and just dumps it right into something that he did. And for Scientologists that are watching this video right now, whenever you're reading something in Scientology and it doesn't seem like it cohesively fits to the other things that Hubbard has said, this is the reason, because he never said any of these things, and his verbiage and the way he kind of uh narrates and sort of writes these things, you can tell when it's just Hubbard just like freewheeling
mm,
and it's out of his brain. And then when it gets into a technology or it gets into a procedure or something, it's a whole different thing, and you're kind of like, it doesn't seem like the same person is writing all of these things. And that clue is the thing that is like, that's the biggest, I'd say it's one of the biggest clues, and the contradictions. So at the international headquarters, you were saying where he contradicts himself. That is one of the biggest problems they have at Scientology International, is they're always trying to go through all of Hubbard's original writings and sort of conform them to what Hubbard had written.
mm,
And when they do this, they find that he consistently contradicts
mm,
himself, or he'll say, "This term means this"
yep,
in one writing in 1957. And then just years later, he'll say, "No, now this term means something different." And it doesn't mean something slightly different than what he said before.
mm,
It's contradictory to what he said before, or is even goes against what he wrote before, that you shouldn't do that, you should now do this. And then later on, he'll kind of flip flop again. So this happens throughout many of Hubbard's writings and many of Hubbard's books and bulletins and policy letters. And
it,
anyway, before I forgot, I wanted to say that little bit
mm,
because it totally makes sense with what with what you were saying about him just stealing this stuff from people.
yeah. I mean, I was hired in '93. Frank Sarge Gabodi, who at that time was running the Institute for Research into Metapsychology, um, had sued Scientology for saying he was plagiarizing Hubbard. And then he called
Hmm.
me in, and I was like, Sarge, you should have told me before you sued them. Really, it would have been helpful. But
Yeah.
the only way I can dig you out is to prove that Hubbard plagiarized it.
Yeah.
and that's when I wrote the paper and wrote it for that case. He, in the end, okay, I'm going to say it, he chickened out, and he sold David Mayo to David Miscavige in return for an agreement that the metapsychologist would never be harassed. And
Hmm.
that's not good enough, really. I was a little bit annoyed about that. Um, but nonetheless, to look at that, if you look at the how direct the lifts are and whether you can prove
Yeah.
it. So I'll just give one example. The original Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health, on the back cover, published by the same publisher, was a book by Dr. Nandor Fodor, who's since become an imaginary character on the television, but he really did exist, called The Search
Yeah.
for the Beloved, an investigation into um, birth and the trauma of prenatal conditioning. So, right there on the back of a book that's the first book that's going to tell you about birth being a trauma that's recorded, a book that was published a year before is there. In fact, you can trace it back to Otto Rank of Freudian in the 1930s and to Aleister Crowley, who also talked
Wow.
about, the
It does seem like whatever happened in that Jack Parsons, Aleister Crowley, whatever happened in that period of Hubbard's life were his core memories that sort of drove a lot of later things
oh
that he
yes.
ended up doing.
Yeah, I think to understand Hubbard at all, the crucial incident is Pasadena in 1946, where he and Jack Parsons um, perform a ceremony to incarnate the whore of Babylon
Yeah.
and bring about the end days under the Antichrist. And that was Hubbard in 1946. And of course, the very last thing we have from Hubbard is the OT8 policy letter that had to be withdrawn, where he says
Yes.
that he's the Antichrist. So
Yes.
everything in between those dates for 40 years until his death,
Yeah.
that's what's
We
going
just
on in his head.
Yeah, we just did a video about that a few weeks ago, which was the upper operating Thetan levels. We just went through them all from 1 to 8, sort of as they're known, but also we did talk about that when they first came out with OT8. It was so unbelievably wild, even to the Scientologists, that they were just like, "What's going on?" And they had to back up and kind of rehash it and then water it down a little bit so people wouldn't like it. They would literally go like, "Ooh, I did not sign up for this," you know.
And people did leave. I'm led
Yes.
to believe there was only a week where that bulletin or policy letter was in the course, and he claims to be
Yeah.
Lucifer and the Antichrist. It's absolutely consistent that, as a historian of Scientology, it's absolutely consistent that he really believed that. When I
Yeah.
first saw that issue, and it was in the 80s, so I think possibly even before OT8 was released, you had this bizarre manuscript called Lonesome Squirrel, produced by Steve
Hmm.
Fishman. And Fishman, it would appear, Antonio Ortega's done good work on this, is a con man. That's what he is.
Yeah.
But somehow he'd got hold of that piece of material. I
That's the weird thing about there's a what I think they're called the Fishman affidavits or the
mm,
Fishman. There's some kind of
yep.
body of documents where
He
it's
was
like the
who and
guys.
Uwe Gertz, his
Yeah.
psychiatrist, was suing Scientology for yeah. And
Yeah, but
I got
it's
on the
like
edge of the
this
court
guy.
case because I was around at that time and kind of looking at this weird
Yeah.
guy. And he's saying, "Oh yeah, I've hung out with Hubbard. He goes under the name Jack now, and he's in San Luis Obispo." And you're going, "Well, he was in Creston." And then he gives you this material, and I didn't believe it. So it took some convincing after two people who'd done the course basically wrote down what they'd seen, and it was exactly what Fishman said.
Yeah,
It's
and
strange.
that's really the problem that I think Scientology, and just to finish off on the Fishman thing,
Mm,
he was 100% a con man
yeah.
in the end, but how he got some of this information, which was authentic and genuine, is the part where
Mm,
no, it's one of these unsolved mysteries. Like,
mm,
how did that happen? Like, somehow he got Jason Begay said it best. He says, um, even if it's a mouse trap, the cheese is real. Okay. The cheese is real, even though it's a trap.
Mm,
There's got to be some real cheese in there.
mm,
Um, but Scientology, even when you were talking about these old timers and these
mm,
early
mm,
Dianeticists and early Scientologists, when we were at the headquarters, we were always trying the L. Ron Hubbard personal public relations office was keeping track of all these people that had worked and done stuff with Hubbard,
mm,
and we would do videos with them every once in a while, and it was a way for them to kind of, because some of these people knew what really happened,
mm.
and some of these people knew what Scientology wanted everybody to think happened.
Yeah.
And so these folks would get wined and dined, and then they'd tell us stories, and then we'd use them in these L. Ron Hubbard, tribute
Mm,
videos or whatever it was over the years. But there was one time that we were interviewing one of these people, and the handler from the public relations office had left, but we were still shooting and we were still just chatting with them and rolling camera. And then they started to get into a story that they were not supposed to tell us. And the public relations person had kind of walked in mid this and was kind of a bit confused. They didn't exactly know what we were talking about. And as soon as they kind of were hip to the story this person was telling, they're like, hey, we're going to take a break for a second. Hey, let's just go over here and talk for, and it was sort of, and we saw it, but we didn't really get anything juicy that would be
mm,
like, oh my gosh, that's great. Every once in a while they'd just make an offhand comment, or they'd mention something, or one time drugs were mentioned by one of these people, and just little hints at things, and you'd be like, wait, what kind of drug, what are you talking about, what? And it would, and also because I didn't go to school, and also I didn't know the references. Like, so if somebody said pinks and blues, or
mm,
pinks and reds and blues, or something, it didn't mean anything to me.
mm,
But then later on, thinking back, I go like, oh, that must have been what the person was talking about. So you get this idea that Scientology's, they've been doing this for years, where they try to kind of massage the narrative so
mm.
that some of these things that are the truth don't get out from any of these people that were there. And it just seems like there's, at this point, there's too many people to keep track of and to know who they're talking to and what documents are where. And it's almost like the internet has sufficiently short circuited Hubbard's, disconnection policies and his information control abilities
Mm.
of Scientology. Um, I don't know. I don't know how they can put the genie back in the bottle at this point.
Oh, it's too late. It's gone. You know, the beast was fatally wounded a long time ago. It's just got a lot of blood to lose, because
Yeah,
unfortunately you have the whales. You have these people who are pouring money into Scientology. I mean, seeing the thing that Alex Barnes Ross, I think, got hold of, but about the meeting that he protested at St. Hill last November, that somebody, I think they'd said they'd put in $54 million. And as long as
yeah.
people are doing
It's
that, it will
it's
persist.
wild.
But it's shrinking. I mean, we're down.
Yeah,
We must be down below 25,000 members of the International Association of Scientologists now. And
I would say below 25,000 members, and including the C
yeah,
organization, which is roughly, 4 to 5,000 people, depending on how you count them up. But um, yeah, they're definitely, you're exactly correct on that.
mm,
They're definitely losing members and not getting as many new members in. Those numbers are abysmal compared to what they were able to do in the 60s or the 70s or even the mid 80s.
mm,
I'd say when in the 80s is when the turn started going down.
yeah,
Like they were going up,
yeah.
up,
Jeff
I would say
Hawkins
until yeah,
Jeff Hawkins'
until
campaign was the last successful campaign that anybody did. And of course, as he says in his brilliant book,
yeah.
he basically threw away all of Hubbard's policies about marketing and PR and did the standard
Yeah.
stuff, and managed to sell this 1950 book that is interminable and incredibly difficult to read, and pushed it back into the bestseller list. How much they were kind of cheating, as they did with Battlefield Earth, and buying up
Yeah,
boxes
where
full of
they
copies.
were buying up the copies
Yeah,
from the bookstores.
yeah. Having given the publisher, St. Martin's Press, they were given $250,000 to use as they wanted for publicity, and a guaranteed sale of 40,000 hardbacks. Your usual first printing is 8 to 10,000. So of course they were
Yeah,
quite. And I think it was Harvey Haber who placed the book with them finally from Author Services, and I think he'd approached 50 publishers who'd all said no, we're not in the slightest bit interested. I mean, another
yeah,
thing as we were going along, that recognizing what Hubbard has or hasn't written, I'm
yeah,
sure that most people who've been in Scientology don't realize that there's actually only one book that Hubbard wrote, only Dianetics. Science of
yeah.
Survival was written by Richard DeMille, who was the,
Wow, I did not know that.
yep, and How to Live Though an Executive was written by Richard DeMille. And everything thereafter, there's Althea Hartwright's 8.80, and leaves and starts
Yeah,
the wonderful Abery magazine, which is all online and is great good fun. As people left, they'd go and write something for the Abery into the 60s. Its symbol was a squirrel. What can we say? Um, and then John Sanborn in 54 comes in, and everything that is published till 1978 has been through the filter of John Sanborn. And when I interviewed him, he said that in 54, Hubbard gave him Hymn of Asia. And he looked at him and went, "Oh, you're kidding me." Because it started, "I am Maitreya." And then in
yeah,
1974, 20 years on, John realized if he made it a question, "Am I Maitreya?" it might sound dignified enough to publish. And so as it became.
yes,
And I'd just like to answer that question, because I can give you an absolute
yeah.
answer. Was he Maitreya? No, he wasn't, because Maitreya takes all of humanity into nirvana with him when he goes. So
Yes,
another failed mission for Ron Hubbard. What can I say?
totally. It's so funny that you say that, because when I heard the story about the couple that had written the study tech,
Mm,
and then they'd given it to Hubbard, like, "Hey, we've got these things, the 3 barriers to study," and then they were like, "Oh, we can't wait to see what he says." Like, they thought they were being good
mm,
Scientologists, and that they were doing him this huge favor, and that he would be like, "Oh my god, I can't believe you discovered this," and da 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 da. And it was just like, "Oh, there's this new thing, guys. It's called the 3 barriers to study. It's going to be the basis of all Scientology study technologies." Like, yeah, we wrote it. It's like, yeah, nobody's ever going to know it was you. It was just like, what? But the other thing that I find funny about that is that when Hubbard he had written all the way up to OT8, and he had developed these operating thetan levels, but there was 9 through 15 that were never written. And the last years of his life were led to believe that is when he was doing this work, and he would give us these operating thetan levels, and instead he passes away. And what do they release that we've never seen, that Hubbard's written? They release Mission Earth, a science fiction series that's 10 volumes. Now, the OT levels, they may be maybe 20, 30 pages each, if you just gathered up everything. Now he's written thousands and thousands
mm,
of pages, and none of them are these operating Thetan levels. You go like, guys, how is this the narrative that your church is telling you, that
mm,
he did this but he didn't do this? Like, wouldn't this have been more important than all this 10 volumes of space porn? Like, it's one of those things where you're like, this doesn't make sense, guys. There's pieces to this story that are not true.
yeah, and there are very few pieces that are true. So, Mission Earth. I interviewed Robert Vaughan Young, who wrote Mission Earth. That is to say that he had all of this text dumped on him, and he had to make it
Yes.
into 10 novels somehow. He also wrote the Rocky Mountain News L. Ron Hubbard interview of 1983, which is a fascinating document because in it you have a real clue to Ron Hubbard, which is so easy to miss. There's a question, what's your favorite work of fiction? And Vaughan, on Hubbard's behalf, wrote,
Yes.
you haven't asked me what my favorite work of non-fiction is. It's 12 Against the Gods by William Bolitho. And in Blue Sky, I suggest that people read this book. This is Hubbard's
Yes.
favorite book. And it's about 12 people who basically did something significant. But
Yeah.
Bolitho didn't care whether what they did was positive or negative. I'm pretty sure that Woodrow Wilson, who made it as the 12th, would have been replaced by Adolf Hitler if it had been written 10 years later. And
Yeah, I was gonna say, does that have anything to do with the Majestic 12? Is that the same thing?
I don't know that. No, Majestic 12.
Oh, the Majestic 12. That's like that's a big kind of thing in that it's funny that you mentioned that because I was just watching a video the other day that mentioned the same thing. It's sort of like um the Shriners and different I can't
Mm,
Freemasons and the Majestic 12, and it's sort of this idea that there's these 12 people that are sort of controlling all of this stuff, and the members are these key prominent people that are either Masons or they're Shriners or they have some sort of new
mm,
world order
mm.
involvement that they're
The
this body.
Illuminati.
And Hubbard, if you there's a lot of that throughout
Mm.
Scientology that um it's the World Bank and it's these
The
guys and it's
Tenyaka
the
Memorial.
APA. Yeah, the APA and the AMA and all these guys are all out to get
Mm,
Hubbard and the whole Guardian's office, which is now the Office of Special Affairs that were the Guardian's office was convicted of perpetrating the largest infiltration into the United States government in its history. And not only, I say always the United States government, it wasn't only the United States
no,
government.
they were
They had
convicted in
they
Canada
had
and France.
yeah, they had
Mm,
infiltrated other intelligence agencies and other governments
mm,
in, I want to say, at least 10 or 15 other countries, whether it was just stealing documents or had a spy there or just trying to get some information out of them in some way. But Scientology always had this sort of us against them mentality that's just kind of hard baked into it
mm.
from Hubbard
Yeah.
that we've got to we've got to steel steel ourselves against these outside forces because they want us gone, and they're going to accuse us of doing all these dirty dastardly things, which we're doing. But it's sort of this. It's a common thread throughout the all of the decades of Scientology.
Well, as Ron Hubbard said, the criminal accuses others of things he himself is doing. And let's just run that past you again. L. Ron Hubbard
What do they
accuses
say?
others of things he
Those
himself is
doth
doing.
protest. Though, what is it? Though thou dost
The overt
protest greatly.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
dear. But
So that was the other thing I wanted to ask
mm,
you. So you decide you're going to write the book.
mm.
You interview all these people. You get everything together. How did you get a publisher, or how did you publish the book?
Well, I approached 50 publishers. 11 of them wrote back and said they'd like to publish the book. And Collins, who at the now HarperCollins at the time were the largest publisher in the world, held it for three
Yeah,
months with an editor there desperate to publish it in the first version. But the same thing came back from all 11 that wanted to publish it, which was, we won't make any money doing this. They'll sue us. And I had
yeah,
indeed a letter from Neville Spearman, who was the head of Neville Spearman Publishing, who'd published The Mindbenders by Cyril Vosper, who I came to know reasonably well. And they sold 108,000 copies of The Mindbenders. It was a bestseller. But Spearman
they weren't
wrote to
being
me,
sued by anybody to offset
yeah,
those sales.
Spearman hadn't made any profit on it. And he wrote back to me and said he'd love to publish the book, but there was no money in it. And he signed himself off. And I had this image of this man in his Savile Row fitted suit, sat there, his pinstripe, all probably with a lovely Eton accent or something, because he signed himself off "Death to the Evil Cult," Neville Spearman. So I couldn't get a publisher, and after a couple of years, when Russell Miller came along in January '86 and said that Sunday Times wanted him to find Ron Hubbard and write about that, and he gave me a check for £2,000, and I'd been doing this for a couple of years, and nobody had given me any kind of money for doing it, so that was very welcome. He hired me as his researcher, and then we found a week later that Hubbard was dead, and the Sunday Times said, well, go ahead. It's an interesting story. And I think we had 3 front pages out of it. And at the time, Sunday Times was the biggest distribution newspaper in the UK. And he got a book deal, and he signed me up for researching and paid me some money. And I sort of thought, I can't get my book published. The purpose of writing the book was I never imagined I'd make any money from it, and that proved to be true.
Yeah.
That's still true to this
Yeah.
day. But so he might as well have it. And I let him have the manuscript. I have his annotated version of it that it came round to me eventually, which is kind of weird. And Russell called me up one day, and he'd traveled all over the world for the Sunday Times, and he said, I'm being followed everywhere I go, and I've got the names of the private detectives. Can you check with Lyle Stewart, who'd published Ben Corridan's L. Ron Hubbard, Messiah or Madman? Can you check with him to see if he's being followed by the same people?
Yeah.
And what he didn't know was that I'd never spoken to Lyle Stewart. So I, he just presumed I must know him. So I phoned Lyle up, and who was just a weirdly eccentric human being. He ran the first gay novel series in the US, Birch Lane Press. He published books about the IRS and gambling, which is what he liked to do with his time. And he hated the IRS. He told me that he'd been sued 100 times and he'd won 99 of the cases. So come and get me. He's that kind of very different type of human being from me, I must say. And on the phone, so I phone him up and say, oh, I'm John Atack. And before saying anything else, he says, have you written a book about Scientology? So I said, yes. And he said, I'll publish it. And then he came over and signed contracts with me. And he said, I've actually sold the company for $12 million to this guy, Stephen Schragus. And I'm signing you up, and it's his problem now. And Schragus
That's amazing.
very nearly stopped publication because they wanted to edit it severely. And he said, well, we'll just drop it then. And then we got sued and we lost the case. Blue Sky, only 2 books have ever been banned in the history of the United States. The first was Victor Marchetti's CIA. And you can understand why that was a bit sensitive. The second was Piece of Blue Sky. And we got that reversed at appeal because I had the same attorney, Mel Wolfe, that Victor Marchetti had. And I'm pretty sure that when we lost the case, the company said...
When did you lose it? Because you lost
89.
it in...
89.
When did you... Okay, and then it was overturned on appeal later on.
Yeah, that's right. There were 17 counts against us, and they
1995.
1990 was when we actually got it out. Yeah, so we won the case in 90.
Okay.
And it was basically they'd for about more than 6 months there'd been a private investigator who had wormed his way into my circle, and he kept saying, that he wanted to help me publish the book, and he wanted to help me publish the book.
Yeah.
And as I say, I'd given it to Russell by this time, and I'd pretty much given up on publishing it. So when he said, look, I'll give you £30,000 if I can publish it under my own name. And I was sort of, sounds a bit weird, but I could do with the money. And I made the mistake of letting him have a copy. It took months, then bang, that version turned up in court. And by the time it turned up, we'd already realized that we couldn't quote from Hubbard's diaries or from intelligence orders and harassment orders because of this bizarre ruling in the US courts over J.D. Salinger and his personal letters. They were available in a university collection. You could read them. But it was ruled that he could still make money from publishing them, so a biographer couldn't quote from them. That was ultimately overturned, thankfully. But by the
Yeah.
time Blue Sky got to court, I'd already revised the 60 paragraphs and paraphrased them. So all this stuff that they'd worked out that they could get me for was gone. Um,
Yeah.
and the new edition, the Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, has all 60 of the original quotations back, plus another 40 for good measure. I thought we'll beef it out a little bit.
Nice. Yeah. Let's update
Yeah, and it is
it.
incredible that
That's
you want
amazing.
his words and you want to know where he said it. As I say, there are 150 contributors to my book, but f fully half of what's in there comes directly from things Ron Hubbard said. And so
Yeah.
if you look carefully, there's for example, there's, September 1950 recording called Introduction to Dianetics, which became available, I think, in the 2007 golden something of tech.
I was gonna say that's one of the lectures that's in that kit that I was telling you about.
Right.
That is one of those
Yeah.
lectures that they were like, "Hey, let's put this in with this," and then that way they can listen to a 2-hour tape and not have to read a book that they're just never gonna understand in
And
the end of that, even after reading the whole thing.
whoever approved the release of that, recording, of course,
That was David Miscavige.
yeah, I'd got his college grade sheets, which said not only didn't he study nuclear physics is not molecular and atomic physics. It's a quite different world. He studied molecular and atomic physics and he got a grade F. And all I got was the college grade sheets. And what Scientologist is going to believe that? Then Hubbard says it in a lecture. I failed
Yeah.
atomic and molecular physics. And it's sort of so you find that because he contradicts himself so much, and there's
Yes.
something to this that I think is quite fascinating. In one lecture, he talks about having become addicted to phenobarbital. The reference is in my paper, Never Believe a Hypnotist, the page number, exactly
Yeah.
what lecture. And he says he made himself a guinea pig in an experiment to come off phenobarbital. Now, I'd got his medical records, Veterans Administration records, which showed that he was taking phenobarbital, which is a barbiturate drug.
Yeah.
What was interesting to me was that every now and then, as in 1950, Hubbard would tell the truth. It didn't happen often. Usually you'd get a
Yeah.
story. But this, and I started to go, oh, it's a close relative of sodium pentothal. So he's taking a drug that makes people spill the beans and then going and giving a lecture every now and then. And
Yeah.
he admits he'd been addicted to this drug. So there's no doubt about it. I mean, and that whole thing with drugs, that if you go to Science and Mental Health, there's a paragraph there about, the safest drug is marijuana and alcohol is the most dangerous drug. And you just gloss over it. You don't notice it because there's so much verbiage. And he's, of course, recommending amphetamines. So the whole
Yeah.
campaign against Ritalin by Scientology, that's the drug that he recommends. If you have to grab hold of anything, grab hold of
Yeah.
benzogen, he says. So
Well, the other thing was that when he passed away in 1986, he had antipsychotic medications in his
Vistaril.
bloodstream. Yeah, so you're like, he can take them, but we've got a whole entire front group that's just dedicated to telling people that you should never do that. And so it's sort of like you when you learn these things, and that's what I am a strong believer that Scientologists are operating with not enough information because they were born into it, or that like they're a second generation or a third or just a generational Scientologist that they were just raised in it. So they don't know anything different. And one of the things that it's taught in the very early stages of Scientology, when you learn about the potential trouble sources and the suppressive persons, you learn that Scientology is doing so much good that people are going to attack and they're going to pick it apart, and you should never listen to those people
Mm,
because they want to suppress you and they want you to do bad. They don't want you to do good like Scientology
mm,
does. So you're programmed very early on to put those blinders on. And so all the information, your only information source on Scientology is Scientology. It's conveniently works out that way somehow. But so I'm a big proponent of, let's give Scientologists as much information as possible that they're not going to be able to get in Scientology. And if possible, we can compare it to some things that are said in Scientology. So, like the thing we just said about the drugs, or the thing about the study tech, or any of these things, a Scientologist hearing that, it's just enough. Like they might not care about the drug thing, but the study tech thing could make them just lose their mind and get angry. Or they might not care about the study tech thing, but the drug thing might be the thing. So I figure if we just hit it from as many angles and just get as much information out there, just documenting it, that's going to help these Scientologists short circuit that blinders thing. Because the blinders thing, it not only it makes it so they don't even seek out that information, but if it does manage to get to them, they've already got a mechanism in their thought process that he immediately puts that into their, their garbage, their mind's garbage can. Like, nope, not valuable information, not reliable, throw it away. And that is the thing where, when you were talking about the hypnotism, I really do think, and when I explain Scientology to someone who has no idea, I say they basically, they give you, they tell you you have all these problems that you don't even know you have. And then when you're learning, when you agree that maybe one of these 10 problems, I kind of do think I do have this problem. They say, okay, we're going to help you fix that. And that's this ruin. That when you then go in to handle the ruin, then you find out you've got another 15 problems you never knew, but they're going to also help you navigate all those. And they, at that point, they give you the deck of cards and they say, here's the deck of cards. You're going to build this house of cards around yourself, but we're going to help you do it.
We'll give
We're
you the
going to give you
cards.
everything you need to do it, but you're going to do all the heavy lifting. And then we're going to tell you, don't listen to anybody else. And then you won't know how to unbuild the house,
And people,
because you're in it. And even though you built it, you don't know how to get out. So I really think, when you can, even if you can just knock down one of those cards of the house, that helps the Scientologist. Not only, it's a weird thing, in order for them to leave Scientology, they have to justify, they have to make an excuse of why they're leaving. They can't just leave and say, this doesn't make any sense and this guy's a con man. It has to be, oh, it's David Miscavige. He perverted it. He's the one who he's the bad guy. So I'm leaving because of him. I'm not leaving because of Scientology. I'm not leaving because of L. Ron Hubbard. I'm leaving because of David Miscavige, and he's a bad guy, and he's beating people, and he's just trying to get money. It's okay if they leave because of that. And so it's this weird thing you have to get around. And most of them, to be fair, when they do leave and they live in the real world and they're not, getting the constant top ups on the hypnotism, that then they sort of come out of the fog, and then a large majority of them
I,
then
I'm
realize,
not.
oh, Scientology's nonsense, Hubbard's nonsense.
Yeah,
But there's a lot of people that go many decades where they only get to the David Miscavige is bad, or even Scientology is bad, but they still think, oh no, but Hubbard, if Hubbard would have been around and was able to complete his and you're just like, so there's sort of levels to this thing that I don't know that it doesn't seem to be like there's just a set way, let's do it this way, and you could deprogram these people. You kind of have to come to it from, all sorts of angles. That's been my experience,
mm.
at least.
it it's I've not just worked around Scientology in the last 40 years. You'll be pleased to know I have done other things and had something of a life.
Yes.
But during that period, I've dealt directly in the recovery, not the escape from Scientology, but the recovery of about 600 people. And to do that, once I'd got the biography of Hubbard and the history of Hubbard and Scientology down, which was 30 something years ago, I then
Yeah.
started in the late 80s trying to understand the psychology. What how did this work? And Conway and Siegelman in the book Snapping, reviewing various cults, said Scientology may have the most debilitating set of rituals of any cult in America. They said if you're in the Krishnas or the Moonies, 3 to 6 months later, you'll be fine. You'll be back. With Scientology unaided, 12 and a half years. That was their reckoning. I
Yes,
wrote to them.
I saw that.
They published that
I
in
read that.
1990.
That was to me, that was fascinating. That's it says a lot.
They've said
It
more
really
since. Um,
yeah, it's literally 10 times
mm,
more dangerous than any other
it,
that
it,
that anybody's ever kind of codified or figured out. It's 10 times worse.
it's the most elaborate system of mind control ever devised by the most litigious group in the history of the world. No other group has
Yeah.
filed as many lawsuits as Scientology. And I started to, I went into the conventional psychology world to understand what the psychs thought. And
Yeah.
phobia induction. Here's the first layer. I was in Scientology. The brain is a switching system. I don't want to know anything about it. It's too scary. Then you find out about cognitive dissonance. And you find that
Yeah.
even there, that when Leon Festinger wrote about cognitive dissonance, he was, and most people don't notice this, he was writing about a Scientologist. The um, this the cult Marion Keecher's group, which he wrote about in When Prophecy Fails. It's a 1950s group. Marion Keech was channeling messages from aliens, and she was going to leave the planet with her followers when the mothership came to get them. And he predicted, and he was right about this, that the mothership wouldn't arrive.
Yeah.
And he predicted that those of her followers that went to the hilltop would remain committed. Those
Uh-huh.
who didn't go would leave, but those who
Yeah.
went would remain committed. And this is cognitive dissonance, that the stronger the evidence you produce, the more it rigidifies the belief. When I went back to Conway
Yeah.
and Siegelman, because I'd written a piece and I'd said something about them only interviewing 3 Scientologists, and Tony Ortega, bless him, decided to publish and talk to them rather than telling me I'd made a mistake. They'd
Yeah.
interviewed 33 for the second book, 3 for
Uh-huh.
the first, but 32 for the second. But I went to them, you said 12 and a half years. Would you agree with me that, in fact, the majority of Scientologists will not recover unaided? And they said yes.
Oh, 100%. Unaided. Yeah, you're right. Unaided. That exactly. That's what I was just going to
Yeah.
say. If the chances of recovery are not that great, but they're not that great even aided.
Well, there are
Like
ways
you
and
have
means. As
to
I say, I've dealt with about 600 people in doing this, and
well, I understand,
but
but
the approach is
it's not
not
nothing.
obvious,
Yeah,
and it
exactly.
is
It's and
individual. Every person you
yeah,
deal with, there's no kind of standard technology route. And what's more, with most people, and this is what really annoys me, it only
yeah,
takes an afternoon. With most people, it's possible to get them to understand what has glued them to this thing and to
yeah,
start the process, which of course they will take on. You don't do it for somebody, you don't sit them in an auditing
yeah,
session with an e-meter. And the first part of the process is very simple.
yeah,
A few years, well, 11 years ago, actually, I had a conversation with a woman in Australia uh, who had been horribly treated as a child. She'd been as a child by a Scientologist stepfather who subsequently was convicted. There's no doubt about this, and then it had been covered up. Scientology,
yeah.
she was 11. She went to the cops, and it was covered up.
I just have to bleep that word just so you know. So
Okay,
I'm just saying,
yeah,
I'm going to bleep that one, but let's not. If we say SA or if we just
she,
say attack, that's
yeah, okay. She was assaulted by her stepfather,
yeah,
um, and there's no doubt of that. And when she first talked to me, Steve Kinane, the brilliant journalist who wrote Fair Game, the history of Scientology in Australia, which is a remarkable book, he came to me and I was helping him with research for that. And he said he'd met this woman and could I help her? That she'd had this terrible treatment. At 16, she joined the Sea organization. She had 5 years in that. And then she left and she did a medical degree and her life started coming apart. And I thought I was going to be talking to a woman of, 23 or something. She was 37. She'd grown up in Scientology. She didn't have any comparison. She was obviously intelligent enough to get a degree. In fact, she was on a master's program when she quit her education. But she said to me, "Is it true that reality is an agreement, as Hubbard says?" And my response was, "Yeah, if you're the hypnotist, reality is an agreement. But for the rest of us,
Yeah.
it's out there, whether you like it or not."
It's reality is reality, whether you agree with it or
Yeah, and
not.
it's not, as Hubbard said, it's not us chanting space particle position, space particle position. What nonsense. The next week when I talked with her, she was jubilant. She'd just used scented laundry conditioner for her washing.
Uh-huh. Oh my
And we hadn't talked about the hygiene hat in the organization or any of that. And it meant that
oh
the
my
process had
goodness.
worked. Challenge
Yeah.
a Hubbard idea and discover that he's wrong about one thing, and then just
Yes.
keep moving from there. But if you don't
Yeah.
excise the belief, if you don't remove the belief, it's kind of the software that you're still running on, those beliefs.
Yeah.
So people will change the words, and they'll now believe in
Mhm.
karma instead of believing in the overt motivator sequence. And when you say to them,
Yes.
"You mean vipaka, don't you? You don't mean karma," they go, "What are you talking about?" So, well, karma means action, vipaka means reaction. You've certainly read the Hindu and Buddhist texts on this, haven't you? No, I just believe it's true. What goes around comes around. And you're like, okay,
Yeah.
I don't mind if people end up agreeing with Hubbard's ideas. I just like them to
Yeah.
think their way to it rather than believe their way to it, you know?
Totally. That's such a good point because that was the other thing I was gonna say is that in Scientology, even if it doesn't sound right or it doesn't make sense to you, you just go, "Okay, I get it." Like, yeah, you don't there you can't you're not allowed to challenge the ideas, or you're not allowed to say, "Oh, I don't think that happened," or "I don't think that's," you can't do that.
No.
But whether or not you accept it as like, okay, like, am I gonna operate my life with that? And then when you leave, for me, the trouble I have is I don't know what Scientology things were from Hubbard or were from something he stole. So I just tell people, like, if they ask me, like, well, you don't believe in the communication formula? And I'm like, okay, first of all, people were communicating well before Hubbard showed up. So first
How
of
do you
all, I
know
don't know
that,
how
Mark?
he, yeah. So I say, if you believe that speaking to somebody in a way that's understandable to them so that you can convey a thought and then they can understand it and then have a conversation with you in the reverse order, I go, well, that's obviously that's something that you can observe and you can understand. The fact that Hubbard attached a whole bunch of significances to a lot of those parts of that thing that's
Cause
happening
distance
and then
effect.
said that he came up with it, I go, that's ridiculous. Okay. He didn't come up with people having conversations. And also, if somebody says something and you don't say anything back, and then they're like, well, I'm not going to talk to this guy because he doesn't answer, like, yeah, I'm pretty sure people knew about this kind of stuff before Hubbard. So then I say, instead of trying to disprove all the things in Scientology that may be workable to a person, if you just talk about the absurd things like we're talking about here today, like, oh, don't do drugs, but if you're Hubbard, you can do whatever drugs you want, or these sort of things are, or even math. I find math is also very useful. That you say, well, your goal is to clear the planet.
Mhm.
Okay, good. So that means every person in Scientology is eventually going to be to the state of clear and no longer be effect of their reactive
Mm.
mind. I go, okay, good. That's it. That is the overriding goal of all of Scientology, is to clear the planet. I go, you guys can't even clear a zip code where the most Scientologists in the world
Mm.
live. How are you going to clear the planet? Okay, that there's the math doesn't work. It's not a solvable problem. There's no way, the way you're doing it, you're going to mathematically solve that
No.
equation. So to me, I go, so why even bother? Okay, why don't you come on? Let's go to the movies. Live your life. Stop giving these folks money. Just do your thing. If you need help in your life, opposed to what Scientology tells you, not every person in the real world is a drug or a thief or a prostitute or, you know, a criminal.
Dead in the
There's plenty
head.
of, yeah, there's plenty of really nice
Mm,
folks roaming around that you can be friends with, and they will support you in your endeavors, and you can support them
mm,
in their endeavors. And it's, you know, there's a whole world out
mm.
there. And but yes, before I forget, John has also written a lot of other books since he wrote this piece of blue. Is it what's the total? It's 5 different books. I count it by ISBN. So even when you said a piece of blue sky, let's sell them. That's another
Mm.
ISBN. So
Yeah.
that's another book. So is it 6 books that you've written then, based on that?
In print at the moment, uh, there's Scientology Cult of Greed, which is also available as an audiobook, an ebook. And that is to give to people who have no experience of Scientology. It doesn't have any of the difficult terms that we've used today. And it's
Okay.
got, to me, the most damning evidence against Scientology, like Hubbard's 1947 letter to the Veterans Administration is printed as it was, with him begging.
Where he's like, please help
Yeah,
me.
yeah,
Please help me.
yeah. It's begging for psychiatric treatment, which he was not given, um,
Yeah.
which is a
That is
shame.
another interesting point. And a lot of these documents and a lot of these things that John has uncovered, I've been through a ton of these things. And if you read those, and these things are in Hubbard's own writing, in his own voice, it's official. They're official sort of requests that are being done within the military and the government and these sort of things. And he's begging for these things that he essentially a year or two later is saying these things are the worst thing you could possibly
Yeah,
do. He's begging for them in a letter for himself
yeah,
to get himself help.
yeah.
He's willing to do these things, even though when he's now the messiah of all this nonsense, he's saying, please don't do that. And my take on that is because, well, if you do that, then you're not going to need my snake oil if you go and get the good stuff
And
or the stuff that might work.
and all of the people who are professionally qualified in the field of the mind are excluded. So finding
Yes.
somebody who's had the phobia induced in them in Scientology, that the psychs are this great conspiracy that is trying to destroy all life, according to Hubbard. And then we have this letter, and it's hard to get the light.
If you send me a copy, I can put it up. I'll put it up on the
Yeah,
screen,
great.
so people can see. But then also we'll link. I'll link again. We'll link to this book, um, so you guys can pick a copy of this up. You have this on Kindle as well. Can people get this book
Yep,
digitally?
it's ebook, print book, and you can hear it in my lovely dulcet tones, doing my ASMR version of it. You know.
Perfect.
But I mean, in this letter, he says, and it's signed L. Ron Hubbard at the bottom, um, after trying and failing for 2 years to regain my equilibrium in civil life, I am utterly unable to approach anything like my own competence. My last physician informed me that it might be very helpful if I were to be examined and perhaps treated psychiatrically or even by a psychoanalyst. Um, Toward the end of my service, I avoided out, and you can tell this is Hubbard. Toward the end of my service, I avoided out of pride any mental examinations, hoping that time would balance a mind which I had every reason to suppose was seriously affected. I cannot account for nor rise above long periods of moroseness and suicidal inclinations, and have newly come to realize that I must first triumph above this before I can hope to rehabilitate myself at all. Would you please help me?
It's amazing. It's also amazing that during that time was also I want to say that that time period when that letter was written, according to the Scientology narrative, he had been healing himself and he had been crippled by the war, blinded and crippled,
With
I think is
injured
their quote.
optic nerves and physical injuries to hip and back. And I quote exactly. And when somebody
Yeah,
says
but
physical injuries, I start going, is there some other kind of injury to a hip or back? This is a con man. But
Yeah.
that's
So,
what,
but
665, my philosophy, he's saying that. Where in
yeah. So
1957, he said he was down on July the 25th, 45, he was in Hollywood and beat up 3 petty officers. End of the war, I was crippled and blinded. And in a Look magazine article in November, December 1950, he admits he didn't see combat and he had no war wounds. His eyes had been hurt by the flash of a gun and he'd fallen down a ladder. And that becomes crippled and blinded
yeah.
with
So
injured
this is the
optic
kind of,
nerves, you know.
but these are the kind of things when I left in 2005, I just didn't want to be in the Sea Org anymore.
Mm,
I could care less about
yeah.
Scientology. I literally was like, I was just working. Grew up in it.
Mm,
I never signed up. I never wanted to do any of this stuff. I was just, it was the thing. If you're a Scientology child and you're brought up in a Scientology upbringing and you go to Scientology schools, they're all grooming you to become a Sea Org member.
mm,
And if you don't become a Sea Org member, you're sort of an outcast, or you have to become a very successful
mm,
Scientologist, or a Sea Org member. Those are sort of the two paths, of acceptable paths. If you don't end up in Scientology, you don't do any of this stuff, then you're kind of out of the club.
mm,
And when I finally then joined the Sea Org in 1989, 1990, go all the way to 2005, I get out and I started reading these type of
mm,
things that you had exposed and you had written about. And this, even that letter where he talks about, can I get this care? And those sort of things to me, instantly, I was just like, oh, this is a con. This whole thing was just a big, giant bunch of nonsense. Like this dude never did anything that he said he did. And there's not, it's all just make
it's
believe.
flim
And
flam.
and so for me, it was very easy for me to sort of deprogram and like you said, in an afternoon,
Mm,
it literally, I watched the South Park episode. I watched that,
wonderful.
and that was really, I up until that point, I didn't even care about Scientology. It was sort of like, whatever, I'm not there.
Mm,
I'm not going back, so I don't even care what they believe, anything about what they're doing over there. But Claire here, she's OT5. She's been doing all this technical. It's part of her
mm,
because she's been studying it
mm.
and doing it for so long. I haven't even read Dianetics to this day. I haven't read
Oh, shame
Dianetics.
on you.
So, and I hadn't read any of the other books. See, I think I had to read most of the what they call the Introduction to Scientology Ethics
Mm.
book, because I had to do a course where you have to read that book. So I
That was
kind
when
of
it was
read
a
that
tiny
one
little
mostly.
book, wasn't it? It was before it
That's
became a
right.
massive tome, yeah.
Exactly. And I've read maybe most of that one, but almost everything in that book you read
Mm.
somewhere else in Scientology. It's a compilation of other Hubbard
As
writings
indeed
just
are
made
all the
into
books, yeah.
one. Yeah, exactly. So, but what was I saying? Oh, so when they said, when the South Park thing happened and I'm watching the show, and Claire is standing in the doorway off to the side while I'm watching it. And I'm checking in with her like, is this
Is this really
is this for
OT3?
real? Like, is this, because it says at the bottom of the screen,
Scientologists really
Scientologists
believe.
actually
Yeah.
believe this. It says that. I'm thinking, like, they're saying it like it's satire, but they have it up on the screen. No, this is actually what they believe. This is real. And I'm looking at her going, yeah. And she's basically saying, pretty much, there's some things in there that have been kind of, adapted for a cartoon and TV, but pretty much everything they're saying is what is
Mm,
in the Hubbard writings. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I've never even heard about any aliens until now. I'm not even in Scientology. And then I go, oh, I'm going to go online and I'm going to look. And then I start finding these things, the letters and
mm,
oh, he had drugs in his system in 1986 when they did the autopsy. Oh, he was trying to get this. And I just go like, oh yeah, it's all make believe. And because I worked for the production, um, you know, arm of
mm.
Scientology, Golden Era Productions, and we made that's all we ever did was make believe. We had guys, we would shoot one of these, we called them quote videos. And it's where there would be a lecture and we'd take a little snippet of it. and then we'd make a little video, little vignettes and little things, and we'd kind of show what he's talking about in the lecture, and we'd show it in a video. We called them quote
Mm,
videos, and we had at least, I want to say, 2 or 3 different people that could write in
mm,
LRH's hand and L. Ron Hubbard's
mm,
handwriting. So we could make whatever we wanted L. Ron Hubbard to say. We could have somebody just write it, and then you could say it. And at that time at Golden Era Productions, we were doing a film where we were supposed to use L. Ron Hubbard's voice, but he hadn't recorded the recording that we were supposed to use, or he had said, I will record this, and he never
mm,
did, or it was a bad recording or
mm,
something. And so the possibility of just cobbling together his words to get him to say that was being entertained and was being researched.
mm,
Like, how good could we do this? And how good can we get another person that can talk just like him and just get him to say whatever we
mm.
want him to say? When you're doing that and you're like, oh no, this guy's writings and this guy's voice and recordings are all sacred. But at the same time, the same people that are saying that are saying, well, if we need to make him say something, we'll make him say something.
Mm,
Then but it just gets into the possibilities are
mm,
endless on what did he say if you're going to rely on the Scientologist to tell you what he said. They literally could make him say whatever they want him to have said.
And the end will justify
And
the
that's
means.
Yeah, and that's problematic.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it's a crazy other world. And Mark Fisher and Janice Gillum Grady have, call it the layering of the onion, and that was something we started to see as soon as I came out. I realized, oh, first of all, you decide that the organization is dangerous and unpleasant, and so now you want to be with the independents, and then you get there and you kind of find that they don't really want to apply all of the policy because it's just insane. There's so much of it; it's impossible. And so then it's sort of, well, the ethics text, we don't do the harassment stuff, so we're not doing that anymore, and we're not gathering information on you anymore. And layers come off, and then you get, well, Hubbard was actually, he was a liar. There isn't any
Yeah.
possibility otherwise because he contradicted
Yeah.
himself. Though it was
Yeah.
explained to me by the former commanding officer of Saint Hill Foundation, that when I said, well, look, he says here he was crippled and blinded, and here he beat up 3 petty officers. He said, well, that's easy. He had 2 bodies. So I hadn't worked that one out, I must say. And then when I said that you see, there's a simple solution for any
You
of
mean
these
that guy
things.
saying, "Oh, the simple solution is that he had cloned himself?"
Yeah. Well, the horrifying thought is there could be an infinite number of L. Ron Hubbards. Oh, and
Yes.
then we're all in trouble. Um,
And they all have body thetans they can't get rid
but
of.
you may know the answer to this question, which I have, which is what became of the tech films? In 1977 at La Quinta, Hubbard makes all of these dreadful little films. I only saw a couple of
Yeah.
them. They all seem to disappear. What happened to them?
Well, all of the ones that he had, that L. Ron Hubbard produced, when I got there in 1990 to Golden Era Productions, they were still showing his films and organizations on Super 8 films, which were like cartridges.
Mm,
And they were also showing, this is in 1990.
mm,
The CD has been out, the compact disc and DVDs have been out, I want to say, as of this time.
mm.
Okay. And they are
CDs since
producing L.
'84.
Ron
Yeah.
Hubbard. Yeah. They're producing L. Ron Hubbard technical training films that are on Super 8 millimeter film cartridges and 16
Mm,
millimeter film reels. And all of the ones that were available at that time were either produced by Hubbard or written by
mm,
Hubbard. And I want to say there was only maybe about 15 of these that were floating around. He had written a total, I want to say it's either 26 or
mm,
29. How you count them is a little different on who you talk to, because there's these things called drill
mm.
films. That's just a copy of the film. It's just an edited
Yeah.
version of a full film. But regardless, when I was there from 1990 until the early 2000s, we shot, produced, edited, and had ready for release every single film that L. Ron Hubbard had written as the training films.
Uh-huh.
And then there was another 50 films that he had written that they were called PSMPSs, the Public Scientology Motion Picture Series. And those were meant to get people into Scientology. And we had only made a handful of those. Those were almost impossible to produce because Hubbard had only written treatments for them. Not all of them were a flushed out
Yeah.
script, but he had written them, and we could never get the scripts approved by David Miscavige. So we spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars paying Scientology writers to write these films and write scripts from dialogue and the sets and the
Yeah.
props and all that stuff. Maybe even over $1 million to script these things, and they were paid. Many of them were paid many of thousands of dollars to write them, but they would never get their final approval checks that it was approved because David Miscavige would never ever approve them. He just would. They were always never good.
And of course, he worked as a cameraman on the original The Keen to Films. So
Yes. We redid every film. I want to say every frame of film that David Miscavige or L. Ron Hubbard shot for these films, we redid at Golden Era Productions. We reshot and redid what they did because it was. I mean, I'm trying to think of a movie that it's like. What's a really really cult classic like just bad movie?
well,
Um, it
Battlefield
was
Earth's pretty
worse.
bad, you know.
It was Battlefield Earth makes these things look like home movies. I mean, they're I mean, technically, a lot of these films are fine. Production quality and technically how they were produced is great, but they're just it's L. Ron Hubbard's words in film version. So it's only gonna be it's only gonna be as good as its bones. And the bones are L. Ron Hubbard.
Mm.
So it's not good. Um and also, they're filled with suppressives. So even when we would shoot these over the years, we'd have to double back every once in a while and redo a film because the main star is now a declared suppressive person. And so we kept having to either redo scenes or digitally replace people. And we were always having to revise them before we could finish them. We'd have to double back. Even the film that L. Ron Hubbard shot, which is this film called it's the professional TR's course, and it's the story of this guy Joe Howard, and Joe Howard is a Scientologist that's got to do these professional training routines to be able to become a great auditor, and Joe Howard is played by a gentleman, very long time Sea Org member named Dan Kuhn.
Mm.
And Dan Kuhn is now a suppressive person that's not in Scientology. And he is the star of the film that was the last film that was left that L. Ron Hubbard had shot and produced and was going to be it was always stated, it was always explained to us that film will never, ever be replaced. That film will never be redone because that L. Ron Hubbard did it and da 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 da. And so that film was retouched and the audio was restored. There was a lot of restoration work for that film, but even then there was like 10 people in that film that were already declared suppressives. And so because the edict was we could never just do the film over from scratch, we digitally shot these new actors in the exact same costumes and the exact same positions and the same camera frame and the same camera angle and the same camera lens, and everything was matched so we could digitally replace them. And then Dan Kuhn was declared a suppressive person, and then they just said, "That's it. They tapped out." And the only reason I know this is because Mitch Brisker, who was the director that I worked with when we did all these
Mm.
films, he stayed there for another decade or so after I escaped. And he then did all he not only did he redo that film that they were never going to redo, he redid several of the 20 or so films that I had done
Mm.
with him. He then did them
Okay.
another time and redid films. And so yeah, they have this. So those films, the ironic thing about those films is because they were on 16 millimeter film for so long, they never really crossed over into the digital
Mm.
world in terms of something that's out in the public, in the wild. And ironically enough, I was the one who digitized all of those films and ran the project to convert them into
Mm.
computer-based files that could then be shown in all the organizations, um, in a digital
Mm.
format. But when we did that, David Miscavige said, this is only going to get approved if you figure out a way that these films will never, ever, ever be able to get onto the internet. And so the reason why those films are not on the internet is because of me.
Mm.
The system that we made all of the files separate. So that some of them have subtitles, some of them have a different
Mm.
language, and some of them have a different video
Mm.
file depending on what the language is. The titles and everything are specific to the
Mm.
language. And we actually built a media player called Sci Player, and it takes the voice track and the specific track of video that's in English and the subtitle, and it sort of like pours them into a mixer
Mm.
and plays them on the computer real time. So you're not watching the English version of this film. You're watching the English video, an English audio, and an English
Mm.
subtitle that are being combined live for you when you watch it. And when you're not watching it, that film doesn't exist as you just saw it.
Wow.
So you would have to, it's funny because I tell people you'd have to get one of these computers
Mm.
and you'd have to know the password. You'd also have to know how not to burn it down because we had to build in there like a fail safe. So if it got into the wrong hands and then somebody entered the wrong password, it would just burn the files down. So there's all these other things. Somebody recently wrote to me and they said, "Hey, we bought this storage auction and it's got all this weird stuff in it. We don't know
Oh.
what it is, but there's this computer system in there and it says Golden Era Productions." And we looked up Golden Era Productions. We thought you might know something about this. And so, um, long story, not so short. I ended up buying the computer that this person had purchased at the
Mm.
auction that was in this storage unit. And I got it. And it was one of the computers that I had built. And I thought, what are the chances that my password works on this computer? Anyway, no spoilers or no teasers, but my password did work on that computer. But that's the end of that story for now.
Mm.
But that is the reason why I think that those files just never really got out there because it was something that David Miscavige was very, very, very cognizant of. That if these things ended out there, they would be wild if people on the internet saw them. And so he tried to take every precaution as possible to make it so they wouldn't end up. Whether they do or don't in the future, who knows?
Oh, they inevitably
There
will,
is a
but given time.
You think they will. And I know at least 3 pop people that have either the audio files or they have the video files or they have some part
You've
or they
got the
have
computer.
well, I have a computer
Mm.
from a
Okay.
system. But either way, they have all these they really it's just like anything else in Scientology. They silo information and they silo
Mm.
things. So if that person does get out or that person does turn on them, they sort of are able to minimize the damage that person could do because they don't know the other parts of the story or they don't know the other player. It's the same thing they do with private investigators and all these sort of operations they run against people like you
Mm.
or Russell Miller. That they're hiring Scientology Office of Special Affairs is hiring attorney who's hiring a private investigator or firm, private investigator firm, who's then hiring individual private investigators that are then hiring, people to help them or do things, or other private investigators. So if any one of those people do anything, there's so many cutouts along the way that it's like, this is not Scientology. There's like 4 people between that thing that happened and a Scientology personnel. So, it's they've had, I try to explain this to people. They've had 70 years to perfect this con and to figure out, how not to lose the game. And if you had, it's been sort of rumored that Scientology have about $3 billion
Yeah.
in, assets and cash or whatever at this point. And so I sort of tell people, if you had $3 billion, how much would you spend to keep the 3 billion? And my answer is, I think David Miscavige would spend $2.5 billion to keep a $500 million of it, on lawyers and nonsense lawsuits and, public smear campaigns and Google ads and, whatever else you can dream up that costs money.
Yeah, what you're describing is the cell system, which is used by terrorist groups in espionage and by international criminal organizations. That you have cutouts, and this person doesn't actually know who that person is talking to, and so it creates what appears to be a safe system. But of course, with Scientology, when people stop believing in it, and when they realize that the emperor doesn't in fact have any clothes on, then it all comes apart. There are no punters anymore. There's nobody to buy. Among the tech films that you did look at, did you have the
Yeah.
David Mayo one?
No. So at the international headquarters, David Mayo, I want to say anything that has any mention of him is something that you cannot read or have access to as a Sea Org member, depending on what level. Like if you were in the Religious Technology Center, you'd have access to that set of files. They have a system at the International Management, which is called the data files. And you can almost look up anything in these files up to your cleared level of access. So I worked in Golden Era Productions, so I had everything that you could get at any organization in the world, that like an organization, a Scientology organization, like in Los Angeles or in Taiwan or in, South America. I could see any of their files, but I couldn't see anything that was marked for the Office of Special Affairs, and I couldn't see anything that was marked for Religious Technology Center or Author Services, and even some Golden Era Productions ones, I'd only have filtered access to some of those documents. So if you were looking around for David Mayo stuff as a Sea Org member, those keystrokes are all recorded somewhere. So if you're poking it, that's another thing. Like you say, like, oh, did you ever see anything? If I happen to come across something, I might have made a note of it or something. But even the ironic thing about that, now that I'm thinking about it, is everything I knew about David Mayo, I heard from David Miscavige directly. So he would tell us that they have these things, these processes they do at the Flag Land Base that are called the L's. And they're these levels that any Scientologist can do no matter where they are on the Scientology training or processing chart. You can pay and do these levels. They probably cost $50,000 to $100,000 depending on how long you take to do them or whatever. It's a very, very big money maker for Scientology because they really don't have to do anything. You just pay them the money, and then you do these counseling, you do these auditing Scientology processing sessions, and they just make tons and tons of money. But David Miscavige would bring this up on a very regular basis, that those were all written by David Mayo. and he purportedly did them on Hubbard. That's the story that I was told, is that he sort of workshopped these with Hubbard and kind of did them with Hubbard, and then Hubbard just said, "Okay, go ahead, write those up, and we'll do those, and we'll do those at flag. That'll be a flag thing, or whatever it was." And so you're sort of reliant on, what did David Mayo do? What did Hubbard tell him to do? Because it was all basically just based off of this relationship that they had had. And because Scientology makes so much money, I want to say, when I left in 2005, this was one of the most money making things that Scientology had, were these things. And if Scientologists were told, "Oh, those were written by the guy that we told you was the biggest, baddest suppressive person in the entire world," it would make us maybe not look that great, that we've been making, I want to say they've probably made hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars off of these. It's called I think it's L 10, 11, and
Yeah, List
12.
10, List 11, List 12,
Yeah.
released first in the early 70s. It was actually Otto Rose who worked with Hubbard on them. I don't think David was in that particular team then. He probably wrote them up later.
Yeah.
And in fact, when they were released, it's around about 1974, Hubbard made a statement that he had worked. These were taken from an OT level 15 levels above OT8. So they're from OT23, which I think is what caused David Miscavige to try and seize all of Pat Broker's files, the man who Hubbard had appointed as his
Yeah.
heir, and to pay $11 million to private detectives to follow him for 24 years in the hope that he'd get these missing OT levels. They still haven't got them.
Yeah.
1988 was the last release. We've just had Superpower since then.
Yeah. That's also something that was very fascinating to me, because it's very common knowledge at the international headquarters that there's no OT levels above OT8. It's just common knowledge at the international headquarters that Hubbard was supposed to write them, and that he didn't. There is, depending on who you talk to, because David Miscavige kind of changed the story around a little bit over the years. But according to David Miscavige, L. Ron Hubbard told Ray Midoff what OT 9 and 10 were. Okay. And Ray Midoff just forgot.
Oh,
Like, he didn't take good notes, and then he couldn't find the not good notes, and he just didn't remember it. And so that, to me, it's just like, that's just what I knew from being in meetings with David Miscavige, is like, "Oh yeah, what about Ray? You didn't even do this, and you forgot OT 9 and 10." You just, in a meeting, like, "Oh, and you forgot what OT 9 and 10 were supposed to be." You're just like, "Wait a minute, did I just hear that?" Like, Ray Midoff knew what OT 9 and 10 were, and they were so mind blowing that they just blew right out of his mind.
yeah, he couldn't take anymore.
He just didn't remember. So it's funny to me that they did spend all that time and money paying those private investigators to watch Pat Broker
$11
for
million,
years.
24 years.
Did you hear this? Did you hear the story about how one of the private investigators, he enlisted his father to become friends with Pat Broker? And then for his birthday, the private investigator's father gave Pat Broker a wireless phone, which was all the rage back then. And that had a transmitter in it, so they could just record all of his phone calls. To me, that's how they don't have the OT levels past OT. Otherwise, why would you spend, millions, at tens of millions of dollars, hiring these guys to watch this dude just in case he might have them? Because he said he didn't have them. He just told this. The story I've heard is, he told David Miscavige, "I don't have them." Hubbard never wrote them. He was working on crazy stuff, but he never wrote up anything. And so, and I have a whole nother project that has to do with that, which is really going to be lots of fun, and we'll have to talk about that later. But I just wanted to wrap up here. We've been going at this for a bit. This was a fascinating
Me too.
conversation. I appreciate you putting up with all my silliness. And yeah, we definitely should do another one of
Mm,
these. I know that you've done you did another interview with
mm,
Claire on our
yep.
channel. And I want to encourage everybody, if you're watching this on the Blown for Good channel, there's a link to John's channel in the description. Please go over to his channel and give him a like and subscribe. And yeah, we definitely should do this again. We have to figure out what other things we could talk about, or we could just do it like this. I kind of like this
Mm,
format a little bit better, where we don't really have any sort of thing we're trying to do. We're just having a conversation, and wherever it leads, it leads.
me too.
Um, because I'm a big yapper, I think they tend to go a little long, but I hope that I let you speak a proportionate amount to when I spoke.
Mark,
So
it's usually
it's
me
kind of a
saying that to
balance.
my guests. So,
Oh,
I'm a regular
I
chatterbox,
was
so it's fine. Yep.
I was giving Claire a hard time that I said, great interview with John. I had to edit a little, like a phone. She got a
Mm.
phone call or something like that. I had to chop out, and so I kind of skimmed through it, and I said, you could have let him talk a little. And then she goes, what? And I go, I'm just joking. Of course, if I have a video that I do with John, you're probably going to be able to accuse me of letting. I should maybe let him talk a little
It-
next time too.
It's about conversation. I think people often come to to YouTube thinking that they're going to see interviews, the kind of thing that you'd see on a TV show. Um, and that's not what's happening. What's happening is that two people who have an expertise and an experience in common are having a conversation. And for me, that's what I want to see. I don't want to see a prepared list of questions and something like that. I
Totally.
want to see where it
Yeah.
goes. So this has been great. And
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, and if you're watching this and you want to leave a comment, or you want to know about something else John and I should talk about, we can definitely list or have
mm,
a sense
ask
of
some
like, oh,
questions.
what
Yeah.
do you know about this? Yeah, so if you've got something like that, please put it in the comments below. And then if you're listening on the podcast, we do put this out as a podcast as well. So if you're listening on the podcast, you can always go to the Blown for Good website, and we've got a place where you can comment there if you want to
Mm,
hear something else, or if you did enjoy this podcast or this episode, we'd love to know. So let us know in the
mm.
comments if you enjoyed this, if there's something else that you'd like
Yeah,
us to
and
talk
and I'll
about.
mirror
But
it on my site. So again, I do occasionally get to answer comments there. I do occasionally have a spare hour, not very often. And but I really think it. You know, I believe that we are a community. It's not a matter of there being gurus who can tell us what to do and what to think.
totally,
It's exactly the opposite of that. So, and I have learned so much. When I was writing at Tony Ortega's Bunker, people would make the most intelligent comments. I remember
totally.
saying something about the training routines, and this guy came on and said, "I felt that I was being trained to be a sociopath." And you go, "That's actually true." Your
It
feelings
is.
are being got out of the way through all of this drilling, so that you can be a weapon of Scientology.
Yeah, and the last thing I wanted to say, just along the same lines as that, is sometimes someone who's been in Scientology, they may look at something from a completely different aspect that I would
Mm,
never look at it from, because I worked there and I was sort of I wasn't there to be enlightened. I
mm,
was there to do a
yeah,
job. So my kind of take on a lot of this is just like I had to learn about the Scientology stuff just so they would let me do my job. I didn't do it because I wanted to get better. I didn't want to better myself
mm,
using that. I had to do it because it was required. It was sort of like on the job
mm,
training that you were required to do just in order to film a movie or drive a car, or
mm,
anything that you do in this organization. So yeah, I love seeing the comments, and I do try to look at the
mm,
comments and kind of go through there and see if there's anything else. And I've actually even done a few videos on the channel that were solely
mm.
based off a suggestion from a comment.
Yeah,
So
I have too.
we definitely look through that.
Great.
Awesome, man. I appreciate it. Thanks again, guys. Thanks for everybody who tuned in, and until next time. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help support the channel, feel free to check out the merch store link in the description. We have Hail Xenu, Xenu is my homeboy, and BFG branded mouse pads, shirts, mugs, all sorts of other stuff in there that helps us to bring you new content on a regular basis. You can also pick up a copy of my book, Blown for Good, Behind the Iron Curtain of Scientology, in hardback, Kindle, and Audible versions as well. There's also a link to our podcast, and you can get that on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to watch another video, you can click on this link right here, or you could click on this one here, or you can click on the subscribe button right here. Thanks a lot. Until next time.